At the edge of a quiet town, morning light falls over a yard filled with broken boards and wild weeds. A pair of tiny shoes sits abandoned on a porch step, covered in dust. Farther down the street, two children stand close together, their hands locked, watching something only they can feel. A former Marine kneels beside a shattered wall, brushing away old paint with a look that carries years of battles. The ones fought inside, not on the field. Nearby, his loyal German shepherd moves through the debris, sniffing carefully as if guarding every inch of the ruin. Neighbors pass by without slowing down, but this little family lingers, drawn to a house that seems too broken to save. And yet, something about it calls to them, as if the walls remember the warmth they once held, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it back. If this story moves you, please consider subscribing. Your support truly helps this channel grow. The late autumn sun had already slipped behind the line of rugged hills surrounding the small town of Brookhaven, a quiet settlement tucked somewhere in the northern stretch of the United States. A cold front had swept through earlier that morning, leaving behind a lingering chill that wrapped the streets like a thin sheet of frost. The wind carried the faint smell of pine resin from the nearby forests, and as it brushed past the wooden houses lining the quiet neighborhood, it made the loose shutters rattle softly. Most families had already shut their doors for the evening, warm lights filling their windows in contrast to the gray sky above. This was the sort of weather that made people hurry home. But for Ethan Walker, returning home was something he hadn't done in years. Ethan stepped out of the worn black truck that had carried him across several states. He stood tall at 6'1", his broad shoulders carrying the unmistakable build of a former Marine. His skin was light tan, with a natural roughness earned from sun, grit, and deployments in harsh environments. Faint lines etched the corners of his deep-set blue eyes, eyes that had watched too many things disappear over too many years. His short, dark brown hair carried flecks of gray near the temples, and a neatly trimmed beard framed a jawline that looked carved from granite. He appeared calm, controlled, the kind of man who moved with discipline even without thinking. But beneath that composure lived a heaviness, the kind a soldier never fully unpacks. Beside him jumped down Ranger, his German shepherd. The dog was large, around 5 years old, with a strong frame, deep brown and black fur, intelligent amber eyes, and ears that snapped upward at the faintest sound. Ranger moved with the confidence of a trained military canine, alert, perceptive, loyal. He had accompanied Ethan through deployments, and although the war had carved scars into both of them, the dog carried a gentleness that surfaced whenever he sensed someone in pain. Ranger had a small notch on his left ear, a mark from a past mission, but it never affected his sharp hearing. He trotted to Ethan's side, tail low but wagging slightly, as he sniffed the cold air of their hometown. Brookhaven hadn't changed much. The roads were still narrow, the houses spaced far apart, and the air carried that familiar blend of pine and dust that instantly tugged at memories Ethan had tried to quiet over the years. He closed the truck door and drew in a slow breath, the cold stinging his lungs. He had returned expecting familiarity, but instead he felt like a stranger walking through the pages of an old life. He made his way toward a small community building, where he was told someone had been waiting to speak with him. As he entered, the warm air inside contrasted sharply with the chill outside. Standing near the reception desk was a man in his mid-50s, Mr. Leonard Graves, a county officer responsible for emergency notifications. Graves was an average-height man with thinning gray hair, rectangular glasses slipping down his narrow nose, and a gentle but weary expression. He had the look of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. His voice was soft-spoken, perhaps intentionally so, as if he'd learned long ago that harsh tones never made bad news easier. "Ethan Walker?" Graves asked, stepping forward. "Yes, sir," Ethan replied, his voice steady though a faint undercurrent of unease tugged at his gut. "I'm Leonard Graves. I'm afraid I have something you need to hear." The officer glanced briefly toward Ranger, whose posture was straight and protective, then continued. "It's about your brother, Daniel." Ethan stood still, the cold from outside seeming to seep back into his bones, despite the heater humming softly in the room. Graves lowered his voice. "Your brother passed away 2 days ago. It was a car accident. We did everything we could to contact you earlier, but with your service status, the process took time. I'm very sorry for your loss." For a moment, Ethan felt nothing. Not shock, not grief. Just a sudden blankness, like the world had unplugged itself. Daniel had been more than a brother. He was Ethan's last living family member after their parents died years ago. Daniel had been the one person Ethan always intended to come home to, but now even that reason had been taken from him. How are his kids?" Ethan asked, the words thick in his throat. Graves nodded sympathetically. "They're safe. They're currently staying with a temporary guardian assigned by social services. Their mother passed away a long time ago, as you probably know. With you being the only living relative, the department expects you'll want to take custody." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Of course I will." The officer handed him a folder. "Their names, Jacob and Emily Walker, 10 and 7. They're good kids. Quiet. They've been through a lot." Ethan's chest tightened at the thought of his niece and nephew. 2 small lives suddenly shattered. "Where are they now?" "At the house your brother lived in. But Ethan, there's something else." Graves pushed his glasses up. "The house was provided by Daniel's company. They're allowing the children to stay temporarily, but legally the contract ends a month after the employee's death. After that, the property must be vacated." Meaning Ethan not only needed to step in as a guardian overnight, he also needed to find them a new home, fast. Ranger let out a soft whine, sensing Ethan's shift in emotion. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's head, grounding himself. "I'll take care of it," he said quietly. Graves nodded. "I believe you will. Daniel always spoke highly of you." He took a breath. "If you need anything, guidance, papers, anything at all, my office is open." Ethan thanked him and left the building, stepping back into the biting cold as Ranger pressed close to his leg. The street lamps flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across the pavement as he walked toward the truck. Everything felt surreal, the weather, the town, the news. But as Ranger nudged his hand, Ethan finally exhaled and allowed himself to confront the weight of what lay ahead. He had returned home expecting rest. Instead, he had stepped into loss, responsibility, and a race against time to keep the last pieces of his family from falling apart. The month ahead would test every skill he had, but he would not abandon Jacob and Emily. He owed Daniel that much, and he owed the children even more. Ethan climbed into the truck, Ranger following. He turned the engine on and drove toward his brother's house, the first of many roads he would travel as he stepped into his new role. Not as a Marine, but as a guardian. The journey had just begun. Ethan woke before sunrise the next morning, the air in Brookhaven still icy from the lingering cold front. He hadn't slept much. His mind kept circling the same thoughts. Jake and Emily, the 1-month deadline, and the looming responsibility of finding them a home. The modest military stipend he received post-service barely covered basic expenses, and every rental listing he'd seen the previous night was far beyond what he could afford. Still, he forced himself out of bed, brewed a cup of bitter coffee, and glanced at Ranger, who sat alert near the window as if sensing the weight pressing on his owner's shoulders. The German shepherd's amber eyes followed Ethan's movements, and when Ethan finally grabbed his jacket, Ranger stood and walked beside him, as if ready for whatever came next. For the next few days, Ethan traveled around town and beyond, checking rental signs, meeting landlords, and visiting small real estate offices. Everyone he talked to seemed friendly, but the moment they mentioned price, Ethan felt like the ground slipped away beneath him. Even the smallest studio apartments in the outskirts of town demanded deposits he couldn't reach. One landlord, a lanky man named Greg Thompson with a reddish beard and worn denim jacket, tried to be sympathetic. Greg had a narrow face, freckles scattered across his cheeks, and a tiredness in his green eyes that suggested life had pushed him around more than once. "Wish I could help you, man," he said genuinely. "But even if I gave you a discount, it'd still be too much." Ethan appreciated the honesty, but each failed attempt tightened the invisible rope around his chest. By the end of the week, Ethan stopped at a small local convenience store to get a drink before picking up Jake and Emily from the temporary guardian. The store was old, with faded ads taped crookedly to the windows. Behind the counter stood a woman in her late 50s named Marlene Duggar, a short and round lady with silver hair pulled into a bun, soft hazel eyes, and a motherly warmth that radiated even when she only said hello. She had seen Ethan grow up and greeted him with a gentle smile as he entered. Ethan nodded politely, too exhausted for conversation. Ranger stayed close to his leg, earning a fond chuckle from Marlene. "Still got that protective streak, huh?" she teased softly, reaching over the counter to give the dog a quick pat. As Ethan browsed the aisles, he overheard two men near the back of the store speaking loudly. One of them, a burly man in his 40s with a shaved head and thick arms, wore a reflective vest from the local sanitation department. The other was a younger, slim man with messy blonde hair, pale skin, and sharp features. The older man grunted, "They're finally selling that old house again. Surprised it's still standing, honestly." "What? The one on Willow Creek Road?" the younger man asked before scoffing. "Why would anyone buy that dump?" "Because the price is practically nothing," the older man replied. "Owner passed away with no family. Town's selling it just to cut tax losses." Ethan froze where he stood. Willow Creek Road. He knew that area, quiet, isolated, but close enough to the main highway, the kind of place overlooked for years. He approached the two men. "Excuse me," Ethan began, maintaining a calm, respectful tone. "Did you say the house is for sale?" The older man turned, studying Ethan for a moment. His expression softened when he noticed the military posture and the worn dog at his side. "Yeah, Town Hall listed it yesterday. Probably more trouble than it's worth, though. Roof's practically a sieve and yard looks like a jungle." "Do you know the address?" Ethan asked. The man nodded. 112 Willow Creek. Good luck with it if you're crazy enough to try." Ethan didn't respond. He thanked them, grabbed his drink, and left the store with Ranger trotting beside him. As he walked to the truck, he felt something unexpected, a flicker of hope. Willow Creek Road was only 15 minutes away. The drive took him through winding streets lined with weathered houses. When he finally turned onto Willow Creek, he immediately saw the property. The house sat deeper into the lot than the others, partially hidden behind overgrown bushes. The once white paint had chipped into a patchy mix of gray and brown. Several windows were shattered, covered by warped plywood that rattled softly in the wind. The roof sagged inward where water damage had likely eaten through the support beams. The grass grew up nearly to Ethan's waist, swallowing what had once been a walkway. Ranger leapt out of the truck first, nose in the air, muscles alert. As Ethan stepped through the tall grass, the dog sniffed aggressively around each patch, growling low whenever he sensed rot beneath the surface. Twice, Ranger blocked Ethan's step, nudging him away from unstable ground. Ethan examined the collapsed porch beams, the peeling siding, the open gaps along the roofline. It was bad, maybe worse than he expected. But as he circled the exterior, he noticed things most people wouldn't. The foundation was straight, the house frame appeared intact, and the overall layout seemed simple enough to rebuild with basic tools and enough time. The lot size was bigger than most in the neighborhood, and the property faced morning sunlight, something that could be used to make the house feel brighter when fixed. It wasn't just a ruin, it was potential. Later that afternoon, Ethan returned with Jake and Emily. Jake, with his messy brown hair and slender frame, stayed close to Ranger while Emily clung to Ethan's hand, her blue eyes wide with uncertainty. The children looked fragile, shoulders slumped, expressions tired, but they still followed Ethan without complaint. Emily's voice shook slightly. "Uncle Ethan, is this going to be our home?" Ethan knelt so he could meet her eyes. "Maybe," he said honestly. "It needs a lot of work, but homes aren't about perfection. They're about starting somewhere." Jake gently touched the cracked siding with trembling fingers. "It looks scary," he murmured, then glanced at Ranger. "But if Ranger thinks it's safe, maybe it's okay." The dog barked softly, as if offering reassurance. Ethan stood and looked at the collapsing structure. It was broken, just like his family, but broken things could be rebuilt. He straightened his back, breathing in the cold air. "Let's see what we can make of it." The decision would change everything. Ethan returned to Willow Creek Road the next morning, with a determination that surprised even himself. The cold air still clung to the early hours, but the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees and cast a pale glow onto the overgrown lawn. Ranger hopped out of the truck, tail raised and alert, as if understanding the importance of this day. Jake and Emily followed more cautiously, bundled in oversized jackets donated by the temporary guardian, their expressions a mixture of fear, curiosity, and lingering grief. Today, Ethan was not just visiting the abandoned house. He was claiming it. Inside Town Hall, the purchasing process was shockingly simple. Perhaps too simple. The county clerk, Mrs. Fiona Reed, a petite woman in her early 60s with short silver hair and rectangular glasses, guided him through the paperwork. She had a calm demeanor, her gentle voice revealing years of experience dealing with distressed residents or unusual property sales. Her soft wrinkles framed a face that had seen plenty of people making desperate decisions, but she never judged them. "A place like this, it'll take a lot of heart," she said as she stamped the final page. "But something tells me you've got plenty." Ethan nodded, appreciating the unwavering sincerity behind her words. By midday, he stood in front of the house with signed documents in hand. It was officially his. Jake and Emily stayed close, watching as Ranger trotted through the tall grass, nose high, clearing the perimeter like a seasoned scout. Ethan grabbed the tools he'd borrowed from a local donation shed, an old crowbar, a dull handsaw, gloves full of holes, and began the grueling work. The first step was clearing the inside. The moment Ethan pushed open the broken door, The stale smell of mold, rot, and long-discarded belongings hit them like a wave. Ranger sneezed, ears twitching. Jake covered his nose with his sleeve, and Emily pressed closer to Ethan's leg. "Stay near Ranger," Ethan told them gently, earning a reassuring bark from the German shepherd. They worked slowly but deliberately. Ethan tore down the soft, sagging sections of the ceiling where rain had chewed through the wood, each pull of the crowbar sending dusty debris floating into the air. Jake, thinner than most boys his age, moved with surprising efficiency as he collected loose wires, broken tiles, and scraps of metal. He didn't complain. He rarely did, a trait he had inherited from watching his father shoulder burdens silently. Emily, small and fair-skinned with long, sandy blonde hair falling into her eyes, wiped down the window frames with torn fabric Ethan found in an old storage box. She hummed quietly under her breath, a soft, trembling tune that told Ethan she was trying to be brave despite her fear. Every few minutes, Ranger would patrol the room, sniffing the floorboards. When he found a weak spot, he growled low and nudged Ethan away. Once, Ranger tugged at Ethan's pant, leg just before a section of rotten wood snapped under a misplaced step. The dog had saved him from a fall that could have broken his leg. Ethan knelt and rubbed Ranger's ears. "Good boy," he whispered. Ranger's tail thumped once against the dusty floor. Hours passed, and by late afternoon, the front room looked only slightly less catastrophic, but it was a start. The neighbors, drawn by the unusual activity and the unmistakable thuds and crashes of demolition, began gathering outside their windows or along the street. Most watched silently, some whispered, but no one approached. At least not yet. The first person to step forward was Carlos Ramirez. He arrived near sunset, his old pickup truck rattling to a stop in front of the house. Carlos was in his late 30s, with sun-browned skin, a thick, dark beard, and muscular arms that showed years of roofing work. His black hair was tied loosely at the back, and he wore a denim jacket dotted with old paint stains. Ethan had known him vaguely from high school, though back then Carlos had been quieter, haunted by the loss of his father in a construction accident. The tragedy had shaped him into a man who valued caution, generosity, and doing things the right way. Carlos stepped out carrying a bundle of extra shingles and leftover waterproofing sheets. "Heard you bought the old Garson place?" he said with a small grin. "Thought you might need these. They're leftovers from a job I finished last week." Ethan blinked, surprised. "You're just giving them away?" Carlos shrugged. "Better they get used than sit in my shed collecting spiders." Ranger trotted over, sniffed Carlos's boots, and gave a short, approving bark. Carlos chuckled. "Smart dog. You don't meet many like him." Moments later, a few young workers from Carlos's crew arrived. 3 men in their 20s with rough hands, friendly smiles, and paint-speckled clothes. They were introduced simply as Diego, Tyler, and Marco. None needed deep description. They were strong, honest, and eager to learn. "We can take a look at the roof tomorrow," Tyler said. "It's a mess, but fixable." As they spoke, another figure approached from across the street. Tom Harris, the local electrician. Tom was in his late 40s, tall and lean with a bushy mustache peppered with gray. He had sharp cheekbones, a permanently furrowed brow, and the kind of walk that suggested years of crawling under houses and inside attics. Tom had always been known as a bit gruff, not because he disliked people, but because he'd lost his wife a decade ago and never quite recovered from the grief. Still, he was fair, reliable, and stubbornly principled. "You planning to turn on power in here?" Tom asked dryly, arms crossed. Eventually, Ethan replied. Tom sighed, then stepped inside without asking permission. Then you're gonna need help before you burn the place down. His tone was blunt, but his intentions were sincere. He inspected the wiring with a flashlight, muttering to himself. After a few minutes, he nodded. Some circuits are salvageable, others not so much. I'll mark what's safe and what's suicide. Ethan felt something lighten in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in days. He was no longer doing this alone. The last helper of the day was Mrs. Patterson, who waddled across the street carrying a tray of lemonade and sandwiches. Small, short, and slightly hunched, she had curly gray hair and soft brown eyes full of wisdom and mischief. "Can't let you all work yourselves into ghosts," she said cheerfully. "Eat." Even Ranger got a treat, a piece of turkey wrapped in a napkin. By the end of the week, the house still looked rough, but the progress was real. The children's room was cleared, the kitchen had taken shape again, and the living room no longer felt like a cave buried in dust. It wasn't much, but it was hope. Word traveled quickly in Brookhaven. It always did. Within a week, nearly everyone along Willow Creek Road had heard about the former Marine and his two young niece and nephew trying to rebuild the old Garson house from the ground up. Some residents were quietly impressed, others merely curious, and a few, like Jason Cooper, carried a mix of guilt and admiration. Jason, a man in his early 30s with a lean build, short, dark blonde hair, and a tendency to judge too quickly, had initially dismissed Ethan's efforts. Jason's sharp jawline and perpetually narrowed hazel eyes gave him an appearance of someone constantly bracing for disappointment. His life hadn't been easy. He'd grown up in a broken home, moving from place to place, which made him skeptical of anyone trying to fix things. But every day as he walked past the house for work, he saw Ethan still pushing through, covered in dust, sweat, and determination. Something about that consistency began to soften Jason's edges. Ethan, oblivious to the change in perception, focused entirely on the work ahead. The house was transitioning from ruin to structure. Each morning, he mapped out a new section to fix. Today, he tackled the living room, which had once been weighed down by moldy drywall and debris. With Ranger patrolling nearby, Ethan sifted through old boards and usable fragments. He used the crowbar to strip away the last layers of damaged material, revealing the first hints of usable framework beneath. Jake helped organize the piles of lumber, while Emily brushed dust from the windowsills in slow, careful strokes. The room still smelled faintly of mildew, but it was beginning to resemble something livable. By mid-afternoon, Ethan started constructing temporary doors using thick plywood sheets donated by a neighbor from 2 streets over, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Martin Briggs. Martin was in his late 40s, with deep brown skin, a shaved head, and arms thick from years of hauling lumber at the mill. His quiet, steady voice and warm smile made him seem approachable, though his size might intimidate strangers. "These should buy you time until you can fit real doors," he said with a friendly nod. Martin was known as a gentle giant in the community, the kind of man who never raised his voice and always found solutions instead of problems. Ethan thanked him sincerely. Inside, the living room gradually grew more defined. Ethan built a frame for a new wall section, hammered panels in place, and smoothed out rough edges. Meanwhile, Ranger remained alert, nose twitching every few minutes. Twice, the dog nudged Ethan away from older boards that emitted a faint damp smell. Ethan trusted the dog implicitly and avoided the compromised areas. Without Ranger, half of his progress might have turned into injury. When the sun climbed higher, Ethan moved to the task he'd been planning for days, constructing pallet beds for Jake and Emily. The pallets had come from a local warehouse that agreed to let him take a few old ones. Jake watched with fascination as Ethan sanded the wood, trimmed rough corners, and measured each plank meticulously. For a boy who had recently lost his father, the sight of his uncle building a bed specifically for him brought a spark to his eyes Ethan hadn't seen in weeks. Emily sat cross-legged beside the tools, tracing little shapes into the dust with her fingers. Her soft golden hair caught the light as she hummed one of her father's old lullabies. While Ethan worked, Mrs. Patterson wandered over again, holding a bowl of freshly cut watermelon. Today she wore a green sweater knitted decades ago, her curly gray hair neatly pinned back, her eyes glowing with grandmotherly warmth. "Thought you all could use a break," she said. Jake and Emily hurried toward her with bright smiles, and even Ranger wagged his tail upon seeing her. She patted Ethan's arm. "You're giving these children more than a home," she whispered. "You're giving them something to believe in again." By late afternoon, Ethan finished assembling both beds and carried them into the children's room. Jake sat on his with disbelief, running his fingers over the smooth wooden surface. Emily crawled onto hers, lying down and stretching her arms wide before giggling softly. That sound, a real, unrestrained giggle, was something Ethan hadn't heard since the funeral. The warmth of it filled the small room and eased some of the ache in his chest. Ethan then moved to the kitchen, where he had begun constructing shelves out of reclaimed wood. These were uneven pieces of oak and pine rescued from demolition sites, but when sanded and varnished lightly, they became surprisingly charming. He installed the first shelf with careful precision, securing it deep into the wall studs. The kitchen, once the darkest and most hopeless part of the house, was slowly transforming into a space with character and function. Outside, the yard echoed with laughter. Jake and Emily chased Ranger in circles, their footsteps kicking up dust, their voices carrying through the air in high, exuberant notes. Even Jason Cooper, who happened to be returning home from work, paused on the sidewalk and watched them for a long moment. The skepticism in his eyes softened. He didn't say a word, but for the first time, he lifted a hand in a small wave toward Ethan. Ethan nodded back, a brief gesture of mutual respect forming between the two men. As the sun dipped toward the horizon and the temperature began to drop, Ethan stepped back to survey the house. Rough, unfinished, still far from where it needed to be, but undeniably alive again. And so were the children. So was he. This broken place was becoming a home, and everyone around it, humans and dog, was healing alongside it. By early spring, the house on Willow Creek Road no longer resembled the abandoned shell Ethan had first walked into. Instead, it glowed with the warmth of lived-in spaces, patched together through effort, resilience, and quiet acts of kindness from a growing circle of neighbors. The crisp morning light filtered through the newly installed windows, scattering soft gold across the walls. The air still carried a faint scent of sawdust and fresh paint, but this time it mixed with something gentler. Breakfast cooking on a modest stove, the giggles of children, and the soft padding of Ranger's paws as he patrolled his territory. Jake and Emily's bedroom was the first space that felt truly finished. The room, once dark and mold-stained, now looked bright and welcoming. 2 handmade pallet beds, sturdy, smooth, and crafted from reclaimed wood, sat on opposite sides of the room. Ethan had built them with careful precision, adding small carved details at the corners. Emily's bed had delicate star shapes etched into the wooden rim, while Jake's bore simple geometric patterns he had chosen himself. Next to each bed stood a small wooden dresser, also made by Ethan, polished to a warm honey color. The light blue paint on the walls made the room feel expansive, while soft cream curtains fluttered gently whenever wind brushed the window. The kitchen, though far from luxurious, had become the beating heart of the home. Its reclaimed wood shelves carried mismatched bowls and dishes donated by neighbors or bought for mere dollars at garage sales. The counters, patched together from sanded lumber, glowed warmly under the soft yellow bulbs Ethan had installed. Even the imperfections, slightly uneven boards, knots in the wood, lines where pieces didn't quite match, gave the space character. It felt like a kitchen that had lived a life. A kitchen built by hand and by heart. The small stovetop that Ethan had purchased second-hand hummed with reliability as breakfast cooked each morning. The living room had transformed even more dramatically. Where debris and darkness once loomed, now stood a warm, inviting space filled with sunlight. Ethan's homemade sofa, constructed from pallets and layered with thick cushions sewn by Mrs. Patterson, sat against the far wall, across from a coffee table built from reclaimed wood and old plumbing pipes. Ranger often sprawled across the carpet near the table, basking in the warm glow of the afternoon sun. The living room had become a place where Jake read his adventure novels, Emily colored her drawings, and Ethan allowed himself to rest for the first time in years, letting his thoughts slow in the peaceful quiet. The backyard had undergone its own rebirth. What once had been a wild tangle of weeds was now a wide, open play area for the children. Ethan had cleared the ground, cut back the overgrowth, and created a place where Jake and Emily could run freely with Ranger racing beside them. The dog had his own corner near the back door. Ethan had placed a soft mat there, along with a small wooden shelter he built to shield Ranger from rain or harsh wind. It wasn't large, but it was enough for the German Shepherd to curl up comfortably while watching the yard. Ranger seemed proud of it, often lying there with his chest puffed out as if guarding a castle. Evenings grew peaceful and familiar. After days of work, small repairs, and new routines, Ethan often stepped outside onto the front porch, just as the sun dipped low. Jake and Emily would run barefoot across the grass, their laughter filling the air. Ranger stood watch, tail sweeping the ground as he observed them with loyal devotion. Ethan leaned on the railing he'd rebuilt, the wood cool beneath his calloused hands, and watched them with a feeling he had not allowed himself in a long time: contentment. Through the months of rebuilding, Ethan had discovered something unexpected. Fixing the house had become a journey of fixing himself. Each nail, each plank, each repaired doorway had pulled him away from the grief that once suffocated his chest. In the rhythmic swing of the hammer, in the scent of freshly sanded wood, and in the sound of children's laughter returning slowly to the house, he had found healing. Jake had grown more confident, his shy, uncertain expressions replaced by brighter eyes and a more relaxed posture. He took on little responsibilities around the house, sweeping the porch, feeding Ranger, helping Ethan measure wood, tasks that made him feel older, steadier. Emily, once timid and withdrawn, now hummed as she played, her small hands tracing patterns in the dirt or drawing colorful pictures she taped proudly to the fridge. Ranger had become their silent guardian, always alert, always protective, always ready to step between danger and the fragile hope they were rebuilding. On one particularly calm evening, as the sun dipped into soft orange hues across the sky, the four of them sat on the small porch steps. Jake leaned against Ethan's arm, Emily rested her head on Ethan's shoulder, and Ranger lay stretched at their feet. The warmth of the setting sun painted their faces gold. Ethan breathed in the scent of grass and wood and summer air. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt still. "This is our home now," Ethan murmured softly. Emily tightened her hold around his arm. Jake nodded quietly. Ranger gave a soft, approving huff. The house wasn't perfect. It had rough corners, unfinished edges, and a long list of repairs waiting for another day. But it was theirs. A sanctuary born from loss and rebuilt with love. A place where new memories would form, where grief could fade, and where futures could grow. They had found their beginning again. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with a flash of light or the sound of angels singing. Sometimes they begin quietly, in the shape of a broken house, a wounded heart, or a family struggling to hold on after loss. And sometimes, God's blessings come through the strength He places in ordinary people, the hands willing to rebuild, and the hearts brave enough to hope again. Ethan didn't plan to become a father to 2 children. He didn't expect to rebuild a collapsing house with nothing but determination, faith, and a loyal dog by his side. And yet, every nail he hammered, every night he stayed up reading repair manuals, every meal cooked in a half-finished kitchen, it was all part of a bigger plan. A plan that only God could see before Ethan ever took his first step. Maybe that's how life works for all of us. Every challenge, every unexpected turn, every broken place we're called to rebuild. Sometimes they are simply invitations from God to show us who we can become through Him. Miracles are not always loud. Often they grow slowly, like light filling a dark room, like joy returning to a child's laugh, like a home rising from dust and heartbreak. If you're going through something difficult today, remember this. God still works in quiet ways. He still turns ruins into refuge. He still places hope in the hearts willing to believe. And He can do the same for you. Thank you for watching this story. If it touched your heart, please take a moment to like, comment, and share it with someone who might need hope today. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more stories of faith, kindness, and everyday miracles. May God bless you, protect your home, and guide your steps, today and every day. Amen.